In the flurry and theatre of the federal budget, many details are lost or skimmed over. And one that probably escaped your notice shows the extraordinary blowout in the federal government's GST deal with WA. It's blown out to 4 times the original price estimate and helped make the WA government one of the most financially sound in the Commonwealth at a cost to the rest of the states and territories. And you won't be surprised the other states and territories are not overwhelmed with happiness about this. For more, Elysse Morgan from the ABC's business unit joins me. Elysse, why the massive blowout?
Well, Patricia, back in 2018, the then Treasurer Scott Morrison agreed to change the structure of the GST payments to ensure that WA got more. A lot of us who lived through that, it's a bit of a blur because there's so much technical language, etc., and it was a bit blurry about who was going to get more and whether it was fair or not. And it was argued at the time that a top-up was needed because iron ore prices would fall along with royalty revenue. But now, as we know, they haven't. So WA is now enjoying the best of both worlds. Because the iron ore price has been much higher than assumed, and WA, because of the deal, now never gets less than 70% of what it would receive if there was an equal distribution of money on a per capita basis across the country. The whole thing has become much more expensive than planned. As a result, the federal government has to borrow another $20 billion to add to its deficit in order to pay WA, which is in rude surplus now.
Oh, wow.
So it could be argued they don't need it.
No. Just how rich is the WA government now?
Fabulously rich. Its last budget, released in September last year, showed it had a record $5.8 billion surplus. Now, that is expected to increase to $8 billion this year, which would be the biggest surplus for any state in Australia's history. Respected independent economist Saul Eslake says the federal government will be running deficits totalling $360 billion in the 5 years to 2025. Meanwhile, WA will be running surpluses throughout that time, totalling $16 billion. It's a huge bugbear of Saul's. He says WA's embarrassment of riches needs to change.
Western Australia is the richest state in the Commonwealth. Its per capita income exceeds that of the rest of the country by a bigger margin than any other state has ever been richer than the rest of the country in Australia's history.
So what does the latest federal budget show in relation to the cost of the deal that we struck a few years ago with WA when it comes to GST payments?
Well, what the latest budget papers say, though you have to go up to the back of budget paper number 3 in order to find it, is that the cost to the federal government of the so-called transitional guarantee it's offered through to 2025-26 to prevent the other states and territories from being worse off than they would have been as a result of this deal to give more money to Western Australia. The cost of that has now risen to almost $19 billion. And I think it's simply scandalous that at a time when the federal government is continuing to run record budget deficits, albeit a lot less than had been forecast in last year's budget, the federal government will be having to borrow almost $20 billion more over a 5 or 6 year period in order to give the equivalent amount of money to the only government in Australia, one of the very few governments in the world that's running budget surpluses, and moreover is the government of the richest state in the country. I think this is just about the worst public policy decision I can think of in the last 20 years. And not only is it a scandal that the federal government imposed it on all of the other states and territories, but it's equally shameful that the Labor Party has committed to keeping it should they win the forthcoming federal elections.
What's the solution here? Because the GST argument is famous, and WA has proven themselves to be fairly shrewd negotiators when it comes to the divvy up of the GST.
Well, Western Australia certainly has a number of important seats at stake in the forthcoming federal election, and that's probably why both major political parties have fallen all over themselves to appease the greed of the successive Western Australian state governments.
Wow, what a story. So, Elysse, What's happening this week?
Patricia, apart from your inbox filling up with complaints from people from WA about what we've just discussed, the key event this week is the Reserve Bank board meeting on Tuesday. Now, we don't expect any change to the interest rate settings, but of course it'll all be about the message and the language that's being used in the release that comes with it. The board may be tweaking its language to give us an update on how it's feeling about the increasing inflationary pressures. Most economists still expect the RBA to move in June, so it's well clear of the election and all the hoo-ha related to that. And we also get the biannual financial stability review out of the RBA. It's a ripping read, usually around 100 pages, but gives us a really deep dive into the health of the economy and the financial system. And also it has a look overseas as well about how global financial systems are looking. So that is always a very interesting read. And we are expecting another fairly okay week on the market, and the Aussie dollar is continuing to flirt around that 75 US cent mark. Patricia.
Elysse, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Elysse Morgan from the ABC's business unit, giving us our regular finance update.